In a moment that stunned the room, Sarah Huckabee Sanders completely lost control. But what Jasmine Crockett did next would echo far beyond those walls. The chamber was thick with tension, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and forces you to hold your breath. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, their shutters slicing through the stillness. Every eye turned toward the sudden eruption at the center table, where Sanders' voice cracked like splintered glass. Her words weren't just sharp, they were laced with fury, an almost desperate attempt to reassert control. Years of practiced talking points and polished sound bites evaporated in an instant. Instead of confidence, there was a tremor. The unmistakable sign of a leader rattled. Her hand trembled as she jabbed the air, her tone rising, each syllable coated with indignation. She wanted dominance. What the room saw instead was unraveling. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat upright, shoulders squared, her eyes locked on Sanders with the kind of calm that makes noise look foolish. It was the composure of someone who understood the moment, who knew the weight of silence could be louder than any shout. Crockett's stillness was her weapon, and every second she refused to rise to Sanders's theatrics was another second the audience leaned further toward her side. The tension wasn't just in the chamber, it rippled beyond those walls. Screens across America flickered with the live broadcast. Families sat up straighter on their couches, students scrolled back on their phones, commentators whispered to producers, "Did you hear that? Did you see her crack?" This was no ordinary exchange. It wasn't just about policy or politics or even two women at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. It was about exposure. Sanders' veneer of control slipping, her hypocrisy trembling. In the open light, Crockett, steady and unshaken, was preparing her strike. The air seemed to bend with anticipation. Sanders' rant filled the chamber like smoke, thick and choking. Yet Crockett's silence cut through it like a blade waiting for the perfect moment. The clash wasn't over. It hadn't even truly begun. But this wasn't just about words. This was about exposing a double standard that Sanders never saw coming. Why did this clash matter so much? Because Sarah Huckabee Sanders wasn't just another politician losing her temper. She carried with her the weight of a legacy. The legacy of being Donald Trump's most loyal defender, the press secretary who stood at the podium and parried reporters with half-truths, diversions, and carefully rehearsed indignation. As governor of Arkansas, she had tried to project an image of control, of strength rooted in traditional power. She had positioned herself as a torchbearer of the old guard, an enforcer of a political style built on deflection, denial, and raw authority. That image was supposed to be unshakable. But in that chamber, under the glare of cameras, it began to fray. Her temper revealed what spin alone could not conceal: fragility. Across from her stood Jasmine Crockett, and the contrast could not have been sharper. A rising voice in the Democratic Party, Crockett represented something Sanders had never had to face head-on. Unapologetic truth-telling rooted in lived experience. Crockett's career as an attorney, her passion for justice, and her willingness to speak plainly had made her a lightning rod for those tired of political doublespeak. To her supporters, she wasn't just a politician. She was a fighter, the kind of leader who could slice through hypocrisy with words that landed like thunderclaps. This was more than a disagreement. It was the clash of eras. Sanders symbolized a political culture that thrived on smoke and mirrors, where bluster often drowned out accountability. Crockett embodied the new, leaders who refused to be intimidated, who demanded clarity, who spoke to communities long silenced or dismissed, and America was watching, not passively, but with a kind of hungry anticipation. Generations that had seen politics reduced to shouting matches wanted something different. They wanted substance. They wanted truth. They wanted to see hypocrisy confronted and for once defeated. That was the electricity running through the room. Each word Sanders hurled was meant to establish dominance, but each one only revealed the cracks in her armor. Each silence Crockett maintained only deepened the sense that something monumental was about to happen. Commentators would later call it a collision of narratives. Sanders clung to the familiar weapons of the establishment: outrage, volume, dismissal. Crockett wielded patience, timing, and a sharpness that couldn't be rehearsed. It was the politics of spin versus the politics of reality. And in a country desperate for accountability, the stakes could not have been higher. The chamber reflected that tension. Lawmakers shifted uneasily in their seats. Staffers typed furiously, knowing headlines were already writing themselves. Outside, social media began to buzz, snippets of Sanders' crack and composure already escaping into the bloodstream of the internet. People weren't just watching, they were choosing sides. Because beneath this confrontation lay a deeper question. What kind of politics will define America's future? One clinging to the old machinery of evasion and bluster, or one forged by leaders who stand their ground with conviction? The silence that followed Sanders' outburst seemed to stretch into eternity. Crockett's calm was not hesitation, it was calculation. She knew the power of timing, the impact of a well-placed truth. The moment had to build, and build it did. Every second the room waited, the pressure mounted until it was no longer just Sanders' words echoing but the anticipation of Crockett's response. And then, Crockett dropped a line that made Sanders unravel in front of millions. To understand why Sarah Huckabee Sanders' eruption carried such weight, you have to trace the path that brought her to that table. For years, Sanders fashioned herself as the impenetrable wall of loyalty, a woman who stood in front of cameras as Donald Trump's press secretary and turned confrontation into performance art. Day after day, she marched to the podium with the sternness of someone who wanted to be feared rather than questioned. When reporters pressed her with facts, she fired back with evasions. When scandals swirled, she wrapped herself in rehearsed defiance. She didn't answer. She parried, misdirected, spun. It was during those years in the White House that Sanders carved out her reputation. To her base, she was the iron shield, a woman who stood tall in the storm and refused to bow to liberal media attacks. To critics, she became a symbol of a deeper rot in American politics, the normalization of dishonesty, the weaponization of outrage. Time and again, her words would later be fact-checked and found wanting. Yet she wielded confidence like armor, daring anyone to pierce it. That armor, however, was never flawless. Behind the bravado, there was a reliance on bluster over substance. Sanders rarely argued policy on its merits. Instead, she dismissed, belittled, or dodged. She embodied the politics of evasion, where power was measured not by truth, but by the ability to steamroll questions with volume and certainty. Her rise after the Trump years only reinforced that image. As governor of Arkansas, Sanders carried herself with the entitlement of dynastic politics, the daughter of Mike Huckabee stepping into her own spotlight. She promised bold leadership, but critics quickly noted the same patterns: sweeping rhetoric, little accountability, and a double standard applied to every challenge. What she condemned in opponents, she excused in allies. What she demanded from others, she rarely upheld herself. Sanders cultivated an aura of toughness. She was the no-nonsense politician, the bulldog unwilling to blink. But toughness without consistency is brittle. It cracks under the weight of contradiction. That brittleness revealed itself whenever she was pressed too hard, whenever the carefully scripted persona collided with raw, unscripted reality. And that was the flaw Crockett saw so clearly. Sanders had spent her career facing reporters she could talk over, constituents she could pacify with slogans, and allies who cheered her evasions. What she had not faced was someone like Jasmine Crockett, sharp, unafraid, unwilling to play by the old rules of deference. Because the truth is, Sanders' strength was never built on transparency or accountability. It was built on the performance of strength. And performance can only last so long before the act crumbles. The chamber that day became the stage where the facade met its breaking point. Sanders lashed out not because she was in command, but because she was losing it. Her hypocrisy had been noted for years, defending policies under Trump that she now railed against under Democratic leadership, insisting on rules for others that she herself disregarded, preaching about respect while showing little in return. It was a hypocrisy rooted not in oversight, but in entitlement, in the belief that power excused inconsistency. And so she stepped into that chamber, already carrying the weight of her contradictions. Her anger was not born in the moment. It was the eruption of years spent sidestepping, of hiding behind deflection, of believing she could spin her way out of any corner. But spin collapses when someone refuses to play along. That pattern of dodging, accountability would soon collide with Crockett's refusal to back down. In the architecture of every great clash, there is a villain, not because they are monstrous, but because they embody the arrogance of believing they cannot be challenged. Sarah Huckabee Sanders was that figure. She entered with her chin raised, cloaked in the old strategies of power, armed with indignation. But indignation can only do so much when the foundation beneath it is hypocrisy. And Crockett was waiting to pull that foundation out from under. or to understand the electricity that Jasmine Crockett brought into that chamber, you have to begin far from the marble columns of Washington. Her story did not start in the halls of privilege or the comfort of political dynasty. It began in the crucible of struggle, in communities where opportunity was not a guarantee, but a prize wrestled from a system too often stacked against people like her. Crockett's upbringing was marked by grit, discipline, and a refusal to let circumstance dictate destiny. That grounding gave her a clarity that would later define her career. The truth is not negotiable, and justice must never bow to convenience. When she entered the legal profession, Crockett carried that clarity into the courtroom. She didn't wear the title of attorney as a badge of prestige. She wielded it as a weapon for those whose voices were silenced. She defended the marginalized, the overlooked, the people whose stories rarely reached the headlines. Every case became more than a legal proceeding. It was a fight for dignity. In cross-examinations and closing arguments, she honed the sharpness that would later slice through hypocrisy on the political stage. Lawyers are trained to argue. Crockett was trained to fight. That fighting spirit soon outgrew the courtroom. She saw how laws could be twisted, how power could tilt the scales against justice, and she knew her voice had to reach further. Politics was not a career move, it was an extension of her mission. When she stepped into public office, she did so not as an insider seeking influence, but as a disruptor determined to hold the powerful accountable, and almost immediately, she became a lightning rod. Her speeches were not carefully sanded down for bipartisan comfort. They were unapologetic, fiery, direct. She called out hypocrisy where she saw it, whether it came from across the aisle or from within her own ranks. To some, that made her polarizing. To many more, it made her authentic. In an era where politics often felt like theater performed by actors reading from predictable scripts, Crockett was refreshingly unscripted, a woman who meant every word she said. Her reputation grew. Supporters saw her as fearless, someone who could walk into the lion's den of entrenched power and not flinch. She spoke with the cadence of lived truth, not rehearsed talking points. Every raised eyebrow, every cutting remark, every refusal to be silenced became part of her legend. The establishment, used to politicians who knew when to sit quietly, quickly learned that Crockett was different. She wasn't in politics to climb ladders. She was in it to burn down the structures of hypocrisy and rebuild something honest. That authenticity made her dangerous to opponents like Sanders, because when Crockett spoke, she wasn't just debating policy, she was exposing character. She had a knack for slicing through rhetoric and putting a spotlight on contradictions that others wanted to keep hidden. If Sanders thrived on deflection, Crockett thrived on dismantling deflection. If Sanders embodied the privilege of inherited power, Crockett embodied the raw hunger of someone who had clawed her way into the room and wasn't about to be pushed aside. And America noticed. Young people, immigrants, marginalized communities, women who had long been dismissed in politics, they saw themselves in Crockett's defiance. She became more than a lawmaker. She became a symbol, a voice of truth echoing through the static of spin and deception. Her words did not just challenge opponents, they validated her listeners. They told people, you matter, your truth matters, and no one, no matter how powerful, gets to silence you. That validation is why her confrontation with Sanders carried so much emotional weight. It wasn't just a debate. It was a cultural collision. On one side, the politics of inheritance, privilege, and hypocrisy. On the other, the politics of earned respect, lived experience, and unapologetic truth. Crockett's every gesture in that chamber embodied that collision. Her calm was not just composure, it was confidence born of survival, of experience, of a lifetime spent turning adversity into strength. And yet, despite her rising reputation, Crockett was not new to being underestimated. Time and again, opponents mistook her directness for recklessness, her sharpness for arrogance. They assumed that someone so unfiltered must eventually trip over her own fire. What they failed to understand was that Crockett's fire was precisely what gave her discipline. She did not strike randomly, she struck surgically. Every word was placed with purpose, every silence filled with intent. That day in the chamber was no exception. As Sanders unraveled, Crockett sat with the same poise she had carried in courtrooms and campaign trails. She let the silence stretch, let Sanders' fury echo into its own emptiness, knowing full well the moment was tilting toward her. And when she finally spoke, it would not be with the volume of outrage, but with the precision of truth, the kind of truth that leaves no escape route. She had faced tougher fights before, but nothing would prepare Sanders for the storm that was about to hit. The silence after Sanders' initial outburst didn't last long. She leaned forward, eyes narrowed, and delivered the first strike. Her voice carried that familiar edge, a tone honed at countless podiums, dismissive, cutting, meant to belittle rather than debate. "Congresswoman Crockett," she snapped, "you wouldn't last a day doing the real work of governing. You're too busy chasing headlines and playing activist instead of leader." Gasps fluttered through the chamber. The insult was sharp, not just against Crockett, but against the very communities she represented. Sanders's words dripped with the old arrogance of establishment politics, a swipe meant to remind everyone in the room who she believed held authority and who didn't. But Crockett didn't flinch. She adjusted her microphone with deliberate calm, her eyes fixed on Sanders, unblinking. When she spoke, her tone was measured, her cadence steady, every syllable cutting through the tension like steel. "Governor Sanders," she replied, "governing isn't about protecting power, it's about protecting people. And if holding leaders accountable is what you call chasing headlines, then maybe it's time to ask why you're so afraid of the truth." The room shifted. It was subtle at first, a few nods, the murmur of approval from behind her, even the faint smirk of someone on the sidelines who had heard this tune before. Sanders' attempt to frame Crockett as reckless had ricocheted. The calm defiance in Crockett's response made Sanders' anger look like weakness. Sanders doubled down. She raised her voice, her hand cutting the air like a blade. "You don't know what it takes to lead a state, to balance budgets, to face real responsibility. You sit there in your safe district, throwing stones at people who actually do the work." Again, Crockett stayed unshaken. Her reply came quieter this time, almost whisper-like, forcing listeners to lean in. "The work of leadership isn't measured in press releases or photo ops. It's measured in the lives of people who can't afford to be forgotten. If that makes you uncomfortable, Governor, maybe that's because comfort has always been your measure of success." The chamber froze on that line. The silence between Crockett's words rang louder than Sanders's shouting. It was the silence of recognition, of people realizing that something deeper was being laid bare, not just a clash of personalities, but of values. Sanders' jaw tightened. She had sparred with reporters, jousted with critics, but this was different. Crockett wasn't taking the bait, she wasn't shouting back, wasn't giving Sanders the chaos she thrived on. Instead, she was dismantling her piece by piece, calmly exposing the hollowness of her bluster. And yet Sanders pressed on, her volume climbing. "You're all rhetoric, no results," she spat, her voice nearly breaking under the strain. "When you've done something real for this country, then maybe you'll have the right to lecture me about hypocrisy." Crockett's gaze sharpened, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at her lips. She leaned forward, her words slow, deliberate, chosen with surgical precision. "Real results? Governor, your record speaks for itself. You lecture others on responsibility, but you've excused corruption when it served your side. You talk about sacrifice, but the only thing you've ever sacrificed is the truth. So if we're comparing records, I'll take mine, fighting for people who had no voice, over yours, built on defending lies." The audience shifted again. This time more noticeably. Heads turned. Pens stopped moving. A few muffled claps rippled before being silenced. The momentum was slipping, and Sanders could feel it. She tried to recover, tried to weave the kind of spin that had carried her through press briefings in the Trump years. She threw out a statistic, a deflection, an anecdote rehearsed to distract from the core of the argument. But Crockett was ready. She had been waiting for that pivot, the inevitable spin, the attempt to wriggle out of accountability. Her calm transformed into quiet fire, her voice carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone who knew the truth was on her side. And just when Sanders thought she could spin her way out, Crockett pulled out the receipts. The chamber held its breath. Sarah Huckabee Sanders leaned back, lips pursed, convinced she had regained her footing with her flurry of statistics and polished anecdotes. But Jasmine Crockett had been waiting for this moment. The moment Sanders would attempt to cloak herself in the armor of spin. Crockett adjusted the microphone slowly, deliberately. The pause itself was a weapon. Heads tilted toward her, pens lifted above notepads, cameras refocused. She didn't rush. She let the silence stretch, let Sanders stew in it, and then she began. "Governor Sanders," Crockett said softly, her voice carrying the clarity of a bell through the tension. You accuse me of being all rhetoric and no results. But let's examine your results, shall we? Sanders shifted in her chair, a flicker of discomfort breaking through her mask. You speak about responsibility, Crockett continued. But when you stood behind that White House podium, you defended a man who admitted to undermining our own democratic institutions. You called his behavior leadership, and now you want to stand here and call me reckless for demanding accountability? Tell me, Governor, which part of that is responsible? The room crackled. Whispers darted between lawmakers. Sanders' jaw stiffened, her nostrils flaring. She tried to interject, but Crockett raised her hand ever so slightly, not to silence but to signal she wasn't finished. You talk about results. Crockett pressed on, her words calm but slicing. But under your governorship, your state's education system ranks near the bottom. You cut funding for public schools while sending your children to private academies. You say you're protecting families, but which families are you protecting? The ones who can afford what you have, or the ones left behind by your policies? Gasps rippled across the chamber. A few staffers lowered their eyes, scribbling nervously. Sanders blinked rapidly, her practiced stare faltering. Crockett leaned in further, her tone tightening like a coiled spring. And then there's the matter of hypocrisy. Governor, you once defended policies at the White House that you now condemn under this administration. When your side held power, executive orders were bold leadership. Now, you call them tyranny. When your side ignored deficits, you said it was an investment. Now you scream about fiscal responsibility. So tell us, which is it? Were you lying then, or are you lying now? The blow landed like thunder. A wave of murmurs surged through the audience. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, knowing they had just witnessed the soundbite of the night. Sanders' face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first, just a stammer, a sputter, a half-formed defense that withered under the weight of Crockett's precision. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, the condensation dripping onto the papers she had arranged so carefully. Crockett did not gloat. She remained poised, her voice unwavering, each word sharper than the last. Governor, leadership is not measured by how loud you shout at your critics. It's measured by how honestly you face the truth. And the truth is, you've built your career not on consistency, not on principle, but on deflection and privilege. At that, the chamber erupted. Gasps gave way to whispers, whispers to claps, claps to an unmistakable wave of applause that broke through the usual decorum. Some lawmakers banged the table in support. A staffer covered their mouth to hide a grin. Even those who disagreed with Crockett politically couldn't deny the force of what they had just heard. Online, the moment was already detonating. Within seconds, clips were being clipped, captions being typed. Crockett exposes Sanders. Memes sprouted instantly, side-by-sides of Sanders at the White House podium, and Sanders now, unraveling under Crockett's gaze. On Twitter, hashtags began to trend. Crockett clapped back and Sanders exposed. But inside the room, Sanders was unraveling in real time. She fumed, fumbling with her papers, her voice cracking as she tried to reclaim the floor. That's not true, she stammered. You don't understand? But the authority was gone. The power had shifted. The room no longer belonged to her. Crockett, cool as ever, waited. She let Sanders' words collapse into themselves, then leaned in with the final strike, her voice steady, eyes locked, each syllable deliberate. Governor Sanders, history doesn't remember the ones who shouted the loudest. It remembers the ones who stood for the truth, even when it was inconvenient. And today, you've proven exactly which side of history you'll be standing on. The chamber fell into a stunned silence. Before applause swelled again, louder this time, rolling like a tide, Crockett leaned back in her chair, calm, collected, her work done. Sanders sat rigid, humiliated, her once fearsome armor shattered. It was the mic drop moment, the one that would define the night, the one destined to replay millions of times. The explosion didn't end in the chamber. It detonated across the country, igniting every platform, every screen, every feed. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's dismantling of Sarah Huckabee Sanders was everywhere. On Twitter, hashtags stormed the trending list. Shark Crockett clapback, Shark Truth over spin, Shark Sanders exposed. TikTok flooded with remixes. Crockett's final line played over music drops, edited into highlight reels, stitched with creators nodding, cheering, reenacting the moment. On Instagram, reels spread like wildfire. One side showed Sanders stammering, The other, Crockett's composed face delivering her takedown with surgical calm. The caption read, "This is how you deal with hypocrisy." Millions of likes poured in. Late-night comedians wasted no time. That very evening, monologues opened with the clip. Sarah Huckabee Sanders tried to debate Jasmine Crockett, one host joked, and Crockett turned it into a TED Talk on how to end someone's career in under 5 minutes. The audience roared. Another quipped, "Sanders brought a spoon to a sword fight." But it wasn't just entertainment. Political commentators and journalists latched onto it instantly. Headlines splashed across websites. Crockett schools, Sanders. On hypocrisy, governor loses temper, gets exposed. Viral clash signals new voice rising. Analysts debated the significance. Was this the moment Crockett cemented herself as a national figure? Was Sanders' reputation permanently scarred? Ordinary people weighed in too. Teachers shared the clip, calling it a lesson in composure. Activists reposted it as proof that truth could still triumph in a system stacked with spin. Parents forwarded it to their kids saying, "This is what standing up to bullies looks like." The ripple effects reached politics itself. Lawmakers tweeted support, some saying Crockett's words reminded them why they entered public service. Others, even skeptics, admitted Sanders had looked out of her depth. Sanders' allies scrambled, issuing statements, trying to reframe the UE clash as a cheap stunt. But the damage was done. The images of her fumbling, her voice cracking, her mask slipping had already burned into the public memory. For days, the clip refused to die. News segments replayed it with expert analysis. Podcasts dissected every line, every pause, every reaction. It wasn't just a viral moment, it was a cultural moment. Crockett had spoken for millions who felt exhausted by spin and hungry for truth. And while much of America laughed at Sanders' unraveling, beneath the laughter was something heavier. Something more consequential, because beyond the memes and the applause, Crockett's mic drop had tapped into a deeper vein of frustration and hope, a reminder that even in the noisy theater of politics, truth, when wielded fearlessly, could still silence the room. But beyond the laughter and the headlines, something deeper was happening. When the echoes of applause finally quieted, and the cameras shifted from the confrontation back to the business of the chamber, one truth remained suspended in the air. This moment was never just about Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Jasmine Crockett. It was bigger than two women on opposite sides of the political spectrum. It was about truth versus hypocrisy, integrity versus corruption, dignity versus arrogance. Crockett knew it too. That's why, when she finally spoke after the storm had passed, her words didn't center on Sanders but on principle. "This isn't about me, and it isn't even about Governor Sanders," she told the room, voice steady, gaze direct. "It's about whether we, as leaders, are willing to tell the truth, to own our records, and to serve with honesty. The people who put us here deserve nothing less." Those words reframed everything. Suddenly, what looked like a fiery clash between personalities transformed into a moral reckoning. Crockett wasn't just dismantling Sanders. She was holding up a mirror to the entire political system. She was asking the question so many Americans whisper to themselves but rarely hear spoken aloud in the halls of power. Who will stand for integrity when it matters most? This was why the moment resonated far beyond the chamber walls. Because Americans, weary of spin, weary of excuses, weary of politicians who bend the truth to fit the moment, saw in Crockett a reminder of what courage looks like. Not the bluster of arrogance, but the calm, unshakable conviction that truth has its own strength. And make no mistake, dignity triumphed that night. While Sanders unraveled under the weight of her contradictions, Crockett embodied composure. While Sanders raised her voice, Crockett raised the standard. While Sanders clung to excuses, Crockett clung to principle. That contrast became the moral of the confrontation. Arrogance can shout, but only dignity inspires. Hypocrisy may win applause in the short term, but only integrity wins respect in the long term. And when lies collide with courage, it is always the lies that break. For the millions who watched online, the lesson cut deeper than politics. It wasn't just about Republicans versus Democrats, governors versus congresswomen. It was about how each of us chooses to live. Do we deflect when we are challenged, or do we face the truth? Do we build our reputations on spin, or do we earn them through honesty? Do we choose the fleeting comfort of arrogance, or the lasting strength of integrity? That's why Crockett's response felt like more than a clapback. It was a blueprint for leadership, a reminder that true leaders don't measure success in sound bites or applause lines, but in the courage to tell the truth when it's unpopular, to stay calm when attacked, and to put principles before power. And maybe that's why the confrontation struck such a chord. Because deep down, people are hungry for that kind of leadership again. They want leaders who stand firm not because it's easy, but because it's right. They want leaders who don't dodge accountability, but embrace it. Leaders who don't wear arrogance as armor, but dignity as their compass. In the end, Sarah Huckabee Sanders may have walked out of the chamber that day humiliated, but Jasmine Crockett walked out having given the country something it desperately needed: hope. Hope that courage can still cut through the noise. Hope that truth can still silence hypocrisy. Hope that integrity, even in a cynical age, can still light up a room. And as the clip replayed again and again, on phones, on televisions, in classrooms, in living rooms, it stopped being about politics at all. It became a parable, a lesson parents showed their children, a moment teachers used to spark discussion, a story preachers echoed in sermons about standing firm. Because this wasn't just a clash, it was a reminder that in every arena, whether political or personal, we face the same choice Crockett and Sanders faced that day: to lead with arrogance or to lead with dignity, to spin or to stand, to protect lies or to protect the truth. And for anyone still wondering which path triumphs, Jasmine Crockett's mic drop answer was clear: truth always wins. And so, the headline captured the moment perfectly. Sarah Huckabee Sanders lost it. She cracked under the weight of her own contradictions, while Jasmine Crockett, calm and unshaken, exposed her hypocrisy for the world to see. What began as just another heated exchange became something much greater, a defining reminder of what leadership looks like when arrogance collides with truth. Because when the shouting fades and the spin unravels, what remains is clarity. Sanders may have tried to deflect, but Crockett proved that integrity cuts through noise like a blade through glass. She showed that real power doesn't come from volume or bluster, it comes from standing firm in truth. And that is why this story matters beyond the walls of that chamber. It's not just about Sanders or Crockett, it's about all of us. The kind of politics we accept, the kind of voices we elevate, the kind of leaders we choose to follow. Do we reward hypocrisy, or do we honor courage? Do we excuse lies, or do we demand accountability? If you believe in the latter, if you believe that truth should never bow to arrogance, and that dignity will always outlast corruption, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and add your voice to the movement that refuses to stay silent, because every click, every share, every conversation sparked keeps the flame of accountability burning brighter. In moments like these, history is written not just by those in the spotlight, but by those who choose to remember, to amplify, to stand with truth. Because in the end, history always remembers the ones who stood tall.